Cool. Looks like I'm recording. All right, guys. Well, there's a good amount of stuff to talk about today. It's kind of across the board because we're kind of getting to the end, but it'll be interesting regardless. Some of it will be a little bit of review. I think just to clarify some concepts. One of the things I want to talk about just a little bit more, just in case it wasn't clear, were some of the synthesizer instruments. I was speaking to one of the students, Upo, about some of these, about the filters for these particular instruments. And I don't know if I was especially clear on how they worked. So I want to kind of explain it, give you a bird's eye view of what's actually happening when you're applying a filter envelope to a particular sound. So I guess we could start out with a standard operator. Operators are a really powerful instrument, and it uses FM synthesis by its default configuration. What that means basically is that when you're chaining all of these different, you're chaining all these oscillators together so that one is feeding into the other, into another, into another. And I can actually show you the FM synthesis equation, so you can kind of get a sense for what's going on. Basically in FM synthesis, like you see this equation right here, it's basically like a sine function. Like a sine wave basically creates a particular oscillation. So you see like sine of something. But with FM synthesis, you actually have sine of something, but inside the sine term, you actually have another sine function. So that's basically like you're basically modulating the frequency itself. If this is the frequency of the sine wave, you're actually modulating it by introducing another sine wave into the equation. So from a graphical perspective, from a routing perspective, that's basically what this refers to. It's like you have a sine wave, and then inside that sine wave, you have another sine wave, and inside that, you have another sine wave modulating the frequency of that sine wave, and you have another sine wave modulating the frequency of that sine wave. So you can kind of chain these together and you get interesting results. So the result is some pretty cool sounds. There are certain things to keep in mind about how you affect parameters. You basically have to ensure some sort of ratio between the carrier and modulator frequency is preserved in order for the tones to sound harmonic. So the synthesizer within Ableton kind of does that for you. It kind of chooses whole numbers so that all these, basically when it's choosing whole numbers, it's basically ensuring that the ratio of the carrier frequency and the modulator frequency are basically like whole numbers, and you get harmonic results as a result. So Ableton kind of safeguards you and kind of gives you parameters that are easier to work with to begin with, but it also allows you to kind of get deep in and like, you know, mess up make it more inharmonic, the sound more inharmonic, for instance, just by messing around with the fine tuning controls, etc. So, you know, if we have a simple sound wave, this is, in fact, this is a sine wave, and you could tell because if you go to the first operator, you can see that the wave is sine wave. And you also see the spectral spectrogram, basically a spectral envelope of the particular shape. And you see that there's only one peak, and this is characteristic of a sine wave. There's only one harmonic in a sine wave. It's the only sound in nature that only has one harmonic. As you change these different wave shapes, you'll see that this is basically the spectral formula to create a square wave. This is the spectral formula to create a square wave with more frequency content, higher frequency content, essentially. And so you could do all kinds of interesting, you can create all kinds of interesting spectral shapes, which in turn have different shapes when I play the sound in operator. So this sounds like, can you guys hear? Oh, you guys can't hear what I'm playing, so I haven't changed this to Zoom audio device. So for instance, I'll play you a simple sine wave really quickly. So a simple sine wave sounds like this. It's just got one harmonic. Pleasant sound, right? If I change it to something with some more harmonics, like going towards a square wave, where I have harmonics, I've introduced a second harmonic and a third harmonic, you can see how that sound gradually changes. You're basically altering the spectrum of the sound. This is a frequent. When you're thinking about a sound, you can think about a sound in two different ways. You can think about it in the time domain or the frequency domain. So, for instance, in the time domain, for instance, I can show you a little example. In the time domain, an oscilloscope is a useful thing to see the waveform. So, for instance, if I bring in this oscilloscope and I go back to sine wave, whoops, sine wave. Oh, geez, butterfingers today. All right, so if I go back to sine wave, you can see a sine wave. This is how the wave looks like in the time domain, okay? In the frequency domain, you know when you actually grab one of those EQs, the EQ8 for instance, it shows a spectrogram. This is the sound, the same exact sound in the frequency domain. And you can see how there's really only one peak, right? There's one peak here, and similarly, this is basically giving you a formula to kind of describe what will happen in the frequency domain. So in the time domain, this is how a sine wave looks. In the frequency domain, there's just one peak. There's just basically, there's one harmonic, which is the fundamental. But if we start morphing this into a square wave by introducing higher harmonics, check this out. So notice how the time domain wave changes. Right? And also you see three little peaks here, right? To suggest three different harmonics in the spectral designer, and you see three different peaks here. Right? So as you increase this, the frequency domain picture will correlate very closely to this. The time domain picture will look, will just start looking more and more like a square wave eventually. So if we get all the way to, sorry, a saw wave. A saw wave meaning a triangle wave. So if we get all the way to saw, if we start introducing all of these harmonics, you start seeing, you basically see this. You see all these harmonics here in the frequency domain. You see basically this, eventually this picture tends, as you remove some of these harmonics, it looks less and less like a triangle wave. But you can see how it's sort of leaning towards that direction, right? So this is an aspect of sound design that you can manipulate an operator. You can actually do all kinds of interesting shapes. This is neither a sine wave nor a square wave, nor this is just a wave with all kinds of interesting weightings of these harmonics. So essentially that is one of the really cool things about operator, that you can do stuff like that. And the reason they call it an operator is because basically an operator in FM synthesis just refers to the oscillator plus the amplitude, the amplifier associated with that oscillator. So you see 4 different oscillators. You basically have, you can have the level for all of these oscillators. So that constitutes an operator. So that's why this device is called operator. It's an homage to FM synthesis. So if you have it chained this way, it's FM synthesis. But if you actually go all the way over here, it's actually just additive synthesis. Because in this particular configuration, none of the different operators are actually influencing each other, right? They're all separate. You have 4 different operators. This is basically the analog to that analog device. The analog device, you have 2 operators, and you basically have them not influencing each other in the least. Whereas in the default configuration, this operator is influencing this operator, is influencing this operator, is influencing this operator. So that's basically a little bit more about that. Now, another thing to say is in terms of the sound design, there's a couple of things that you're going to want to do, especially if you're playing this with your MIDI keyboard. So if you're playing this with your MIDI keyboard, by default, I'm playing this. I can't get any different volumes. It's just all the same exact volume. The way to actually influence that is to actually go into the global shell area right here, where you can actually affect how the MIDI controls affect the particular sound. So this isn't something we've really talked about. This is a little bit hard to talk about over Zoom, but essentially, if you use a MIDI controller, what you can do is you can actually map specific parameters of your MIDI controller to affect certain parameters of your sound design. So what these different parameters refer to, we'll talk about. So velocity refers to the loudness or softness of basically how loud or soft you're pressing, how fast you're pressing into the key, which in turn reflects usually that parameter of how fast or slow you press into a key on a piano reflects volume on a piano, right? But you could actually have it affect something else. You can actually affect the filter frequency. So, you know, you could affect it to do many things. So in other words, as you play harder on the piano, normally what happens on a piano, as you play harder on a piano, the note gets louder, right? So what you'd want to do in that to map that correctly is you would basically map velocity to volume. And you might be dissatisfied to discover that nothing's actually happening. Like, I can't play louder or softer. That's because you actually have to specify the amount that this parameter is affected by the other parameter. So if I actually set this amount to 100%, and actually turn off normalize, you can actually see the waveform getting smaller. Actually working? It should be working. Maybe it's oscillator line A. It's hard to tell if it's working. Let me actually change the type of waveform to here. Sine waves are a little difficult to hear. So let me actually change this to like a square wave. Oh, you know why? Oh, you know, I figured out why it's doing this. I have a MIDI effect here, which is basically forcing everything to be loud. Now, yeah. So you won't be able to see it without with normalize on. So turning off normalize allows you to see the different gradations in volume. Basically, this is another MIDI effect I want to tell you about, but it was actually sabotaging me in this demonstration. I could talk about this MIDI effect, but it basically allows you to regulate the volume a little better, because you might find that you have a MIDI keyboard and it's really hard to play. In other words, you press on the key and the sounds come in really soft and you have to push really hard. Well, there are some MIDI effects. There's a MIDI effect called velocity to kind of help you with that. So now, basically, I've mapped it so that now it's definitely different, right? Really soft, really loud, right? So this is interesting stuff. Now you could actually map. Right now, key is set to off, but you could conceivably set key to volume. So as you get higher, the notes will get. This is interesting. As you get higher, the notes will get louder. Let's just see if that works. think that's actually working. Yes, it's working. So that's a, who would ever want to do that, right? But that you can do it if you want. You know, as you get really low, as I get higher, the notes get louder. So if you want some sort of dramatic crescendo, there's so many different ways to do this, but this is conceivably something you could do. In other words, all the things on this axis right here are parameters that your MIDI controller has. And then you could use these parameters of your MIDI controller to map to specific things that you want to control within Ableton. So what aftertouch is, aftertouch basically refers to if you press a key down and you hold the key down, you can actually affect something. So for instance, I'm going to turn on the LFO. And I actually have to turn up this amount to 100%. Oh, that's really cool. So what's happening is I'm actually, so a lot of keys actually have this thing built, these keyboards have a thing built into them called aftertouch. A lot of them do. What that means is if you're holding a key down and you press harder, it actually, the keyboard actually has a pressure sensitivity threshold detector. Basically, so I'm holding down a key. You're gonna have to take my word for it. You can see me do it. Zzz, I'm gonna press a key, right? Now I'm gonna hold this key down harder. And as I hold that key harder, it actually changes the LFO rate. So I'm gonna make this really dramatic. So I could be in like the middle of a solo. If that's something you'd want to do, but you can imagine that, like some 80s synthesizer soloist, or even today, you know, this is something I might actually incorporate myself. If you want to add a little more expression, you know, keyboardist doesn't have the capability necessarily that a guitarist has, where they can kind of slide their finger position and like bend notes. So this was incorporated. This aftertouch protocol was incorporated so a keyboardist can get a little bit more control and some more expressive control in their playing. So you could control the LFO rate, but you know, you can control, we haven't talked about the filter yet, but the pitch bend. Okay, so the pitch bend basically refers to the wheel that a lot of keyboards come with, and you could actually set the pitch bend to do things that can affect many things other than the pitch. So for instance, you could set the pitch bend to like affect the volume. Let's see if this works on my keyboard. Oops, sorry. I have to pull my keyboard out. So I have built a little desk with my keyboard that goes underneath. All right. So for instance, if I turn this again, I have to choose the parameter to map that I'm mapping to, but then I also have to set the amount. Okay, so right now my pitch bend isn't even registering. I think my pitch bend needs to be repaired. But a lot of controllers have pitch bend controls. The mod wheel, my mod wheel isn't broken, so I'm going to try it with LFO rate, for instance. Oh, here's an important thing to do. Good thing I think this is what's going on. See, when you're using knobs and controllers on your MIDI keyboard, when you go to the MIDI input devices, you have to make sure that remote is on as well. Otherwise, it can't access the controls. This is actually on the OneNote. Basically, if you go and you're looking at your MIDI controller, you basically have to make sure that both track is on for basically selecting the MIDI notes, but then you also have to make sure that remote is on. Otherwise, the controller's knobs won't work in Ableton. So those are two different things to be aware of. In this particular situation, my particular keyboard is having some issues with its pitch bend, and I wonder if it's extending to the mod wheel. I could try something. Okay, no, it is working actually. So I've mapped the mod wheel to the volume, right? So now I can actually use the mod wheel to control the volume. I could map the LFO rate. So you can do all kinds of things through this mapping scheme. Another thing that you could do is, let's see, you can actually map more than one thing. So like you can map the velocity to do one thing, but you can also map the velocity to do another thing. You can map the velocity, you can map the mod wheel, for instance, to control the LFO rate, but also do something with the filter, for instance. There's just a lot of parameters that you can affect. But essentially what you're looking at is a mapping between your keyboard's controls and the synthesizer parameters. That's what you're basically working with. And you always have to specify the amount. So if we get back to the filter, first of all, if we go back to a very simple waveform, we have to eventually get back to some sort of envelope, right? It's nice to affect the envelope of a sound. For instance, so if I want to see the envelope of, you can actually set a different envelope for each different operator. If you take a look at the chat, I see something. So I think this is present in some preset sounds you can use. I tried changing velocity for, it sounded like it was affecting a low pass filter. So you don't need a keyboard to be able to do these things. Changing velocity in Ableton works too. Yes, you don't need a keyboard to do these things. This is just, if you do, because today we're going to talk a lot about Ableton Live. You know, why do they call it Ableton Live? And the reason they call it that is because it's a really versatile program for live performance. You can have all of your arrangement kind of made for you, but then you could also do things live with a keyboard, for instance. So it facilitates all of these kind of mapping super easy. That's why it's got these MIDI map modes and these key map modes. It's just so that you can do things on the fly without hopping into menus and to affect all these different drop downs. So yeah, what I'm showing you here has nothing to do with the ability to affect the velocity of the notes on the MIDI editor, which you can do. This is only pertaining to the mapping of the MIDI controls on your MIDI controller to the sound, to the parameters in the synthesizer. So that particular mapping. And then I saw an earlier comment, but I can't figure out the context. I think this is present in some preset sounds you can use. I tried changing velocity for homework 3, but it sounded like it was just affecting a low pass filter instead. Yes, definitely. Yeah, so this could be mapped in different ways, but I'm pretty sure that it's the velocity that's a different thing. Okay, so that's actually a different thing. That has to do with the velocity. What we're looking at here is just the MIDI mappings between the MIDI control and the actual parameter with an Ableton. But the filter itself has its own velocity mapping. In other words, you could set it so that the velocity that you're playing, the velocity of the MIDI note affects the filter in a different way. And that's totally independent of this mapping of the MIDI controller. So that's a good thing to be aware of. It's so essentially, this is a good foray to talk about filters, okay? So let's just first create a nice little affect the envelope of this particular sound. We can make it really short. This is actually the wrong envelope I'm looking at. This is the envelope I want to look at. Make a little pluck. I could turn up the release. Right, a little bit of a pluck sound, right? And I think I've mapped it now. Well, I haven't mapped it now so that my volume affects it as well. So now it has a little bit more expressive control in playing of it. And now what we can do is first, I'm just going to add a couple more operators in. I'm going to set them all to be square waves, just for my own purpose. And you know what? There's actually a way to copy envelopes from other oscillators. So for instance, I can copy the envelope from oscillator A by right-clicking this. See, why would you want to do that? Well, you might want to have the same exact onset for all these different sounds, right? So that's a useful thing. So basically, the way I did that was I clicked within the envelope editor, and I just copied from oscillator A in order to get the envelope that I made in oscillator A appear on oscillator B's envelope. And you could paste in other ways too. You can copy to all others, right? Maybe I'll just do this. So now all of them have the same exact, in fact, they even have the same wave type too, which may or may not be what you want. Okay, so there's some interesting stuff happening in global because I think it's because I set these other aftertouch settings and everything. I'm just going to turn all these off, just in case I'm messing with something. I'm going to turn off the LFO.
I have a question.
Sure.
How do you get the LFO to not be modulating pitch, but something else?
I think you can modulate, we'll have to see, because the LFO does seem to be modulating the pitch throughout in this particular sound.
I was messing with it forever and I couldn't figure out how to get it to not modulate pitch, but something else.
It might be that this particular synthesizer only allows you to do this, to modulate pitch. But wait a second. Let's see if that's indeed true. It's by default sending to. It's sending by default sending to the LFO because you can't. There's no parameter within oscillator A to determine to kind of determine how much is being sent to the LFO. So it seems as though the LFO. Oh, I see. Okay, destination A. Well, okay, you can send which ones it's being linked to.
No, I think you can. I think you can set it to filter there.
Yeah, there we go. So then we could set it here, and then you just have to turn off destination A. I think that's how you do it.
All right, that makes sense.
That's good. I'm glad we figured that out. So let's take a look at the filter section. The filter section basically if we set this filter down here, you just actually turn off this other operator so you can hear what's happening. So essentially, what's happening is it's basically opening up the filter. So I guess I'll back up. What you're basically doing with this envelope and filter section is you're basically setting it so that you could have a filter start at this particular value or somewhere in its whereabouts and just open up over time, essentially. So what's happening is as the envelope advances, you're basically seeing this happen. You're seeing the filter open up, essentially. You're seeing the filter open up. So if I set the envelope to the filter, basically the envelope is affecting the filter cutoff. So it's basically saying how far is the filter cutoff moving over time? Like where is it moving? Is it moving up and then is it moving down? That's basically what the envelope is referring to. So if I set the envelope right away, it's basically reaching the maximum value it can immediately. And the maximum value is determined by where you set this filter cutoff, because it basically only can, if you set this any, notice how if you set it in the high, in somewhere in the high region, it all basically sounds the same. But as you set it lower, it opens up, but it doesn't quite get, it doesn't quite open up all the way. It just opens up until like right here, and then it, right? You can see that it can't quite open up to the entire bandwidth of the frequencies we're expecting. So basically, as the what the y-axis refers to here is the amount that the filter opens up. That's basically what the y-axis refers to. So what's happening here is the filter is opening up really quickly and then closing down and then choking down. So in this particular sound, you're going to hear basically that sort of thing. Because it's opening up and then it's closing up right away. Right? You get this kind of cool, right? This like Stevie Wonder kind of clavinet, interesting. I don't know what you'd call it. It's just a funky sound, and I like
Pulse bass.
Pulse bass?
Yeah, it kind of sounds like a pulse bass.
It does sound like that. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So essentially, you can mess around with this. You have, you know. So this is Vuk was mentioning about key, the ability of your velocity to influence the filter cutoff. So what this is basically referring to is if you set this value up here, as you play softer, the filter is going to open up more. If you play softer, or if you type it into the MIDI editor, it'll get louder. Because basically what's happening is you're routing, so the way I've routed it is that currently my MIDI controller is affecting, the velocity of my MIDI controller is affecting the volume, and as a result, this kind of refers to volume. So basically how much will the filter affect the volume of the particular note that you're messing around with. So that's something that's kind of cool. That's what we set to frequency. So if we set this to 0, basically nothing will happen. The filter won't open up or close, depending on if we play louder or softer. But if we set it to 100%, you can hear a little bit more resonance and high frequency. If we invert it to negative 100%, it'll behave opposite. As I play louder, the filter will actually close. I'm pushing down really hard right now. I know you can't see my hands, but I'm trying to convey it through my face. Pushing down really hard, and now I'm not pushing down at all, right? Right? Okay, I'm gonna lose my voice if I keep doing that. All right, so that's basically what's going on over here. And so this is really cool. So let's set this up to, let's actually just leave this the way it is, but let's actually, the important thing is you want the envelope to be affecting the filter. So if you set this to 0, all that's going to happen when you have this filter on is it's just going to always, it's just if you're filtering the sound. The envelope has no influence on the filter. So you have to you have to make sure that the envelope is affecting the filter in some way. In order to ensure that, you have to turn the envelope up. And now it is. And if you want some sort of slowed, right? to add some more operators into the mix. Let's see. I had a really cool sound earlier. I can't find it now. So something is going on here. I think the filter envelope is too closed. Maybe I'll turn down some of these harmonics. Maybe there's just too many harmonics. I'll go to saw 8. This isn't the cool sound I had earlier, but it's still a cool sound. Basically, there's an independent envelope. The filter envelope is independent of the volume envelope. The volume envelope looks like this, right? It's reaching maximum volume immediately, and then it's getting softer. The filter envelope looks like this. The filter is basically opening up over time and then closing down. Let's close this down. There are LFOs on. That's what's messing it up. Hear that? It's opening up. That's the cool sound I had earlier. You hear the wah, wah. Yeah. It's a cool sound, so you can. So basically, you have an independent control. You have this kind of breathing kind of effect. If you set the envelope, it's kind of, this is the sweet spot. Right? So you might end up finding that that is cool, and that's what you want to do. You might find that the resonance of the filter is also too high.
Professor, I had a question.
Oh, sorry. Oh yeah, go ahead.
So, yeah, looking at the envelope, the maximum peak you mentioned is like, yeah, if you go to the filter tab now, the maximum peak is basically going to, I guess, where the blue line intercepts the actual frequency x-axis, but then, or like the yellow part, I guess, I don't know. Anyways, my question is, now in the envelope tab, so that where it drops down and like plateaus to, like you mentioned, it's like slowly decreasing the filter. Where is that? Where can we what's the visual correspondence for that in the?
So the exact amount, I'm not sure, but I do know. I think I might have to correct what you were saying in case you. What I believe is happening when the filter opens up, it's actually doing this and then returning back to where it was. Because the reason I postulate that is because when I bring this at high value, like there's a lot of stuff at 1,000 hertz, and the fact that like if I turn, so for instance, if I turn off the envelope altogether, you can see how filtered that sounds. Like you're losing a lot of filter frequencies. But when you turn the envelope to 100%, you can see that you're actually gaining higher frequencies. So that really kind of proves that you really are, this is the baseline, and then you're actually increasing over time. To what degree, I'm not exactly sure. Like the other wavetable device that we discovered, it will exactly demonstrate what how the filter is opening up and closing up.
Yeah.
But this doesn't quite do that, unfortunately.
Okay, so it's like how you were saying in the envelope graph, the y-axis actually corresponds to the full spectrum for the filter.
Yes,
like,
exactly.
If you that peak itself, if you put it at like half height,
yes,
maybe that would correspond to 1,000.
That'll actually tame down the sound in the way that it'll be better actually. If we tame this down even further, because it'll actually Yeah, it'll make the maximum height. So as you make this higher, it'll go all the way as far as it can, based
Yeah,
on
like basically the y-axis of the envelope corresponds to the x-axis of the filter.
exactly, precisely. The y-axis of the envelope, this corresponds to the x-axis of the filter. So, but if you set this really low, it doesn't have as much. The x range is just shifted, so it won't be able to access all of the frequencies. The envelope won't be able to do that. So that's why when you get really low, it's muffled.
And that's what you were saying earlier, like you didn't know to which degree above the baseline it fully can go up to, but it's clear that it doesn't like go all the way when you have your baseline super low.
Exactly. And I guess like you could probably kind of discover what degree this is happening just by looking at spectrograms and everything, but you can kind of see this opening up, right? You see the low frequencies?
Yeah.
Everyone's doing the wave. All the different spectrums are very pleased. It's cool. Ooh, yeah, it's even popping down. So you see that. So the envelope itself, right, goes up and then it goes back down. So check this out. Blam. And then it settles in over here. And then when I let it settle in, this is the sustain value of the filter. It's settling over here, and then I let go, it's going to disappear after, as determined by the release. So that's basically some filtering magic. Now, if we were going back to what Chris was saying, now I suppose we could set the LFO to modulate the frequency cutoff. Filter frequency. You can hear it go up and down. So truthfully, you might not want to have the envelope and the LFO on at the same time. You might want to just turn off the envelope, like the filter envelope, so that it doesn't, just the LFO is working. So for that, I always say dubstep, but it's not the only genre that does this. And oh, look at that. Oh, okay, actually this is a little bit of overkill. Because destination B, we don't even have to do this destination B. We could have just clicked filter. So now it's routed to the filter. Same thing. So if you don't want it to modulate, long story short, if you don't want it to affect pitch, you have to make sure you turn off the LFO so it's not being sent to these, it's not being connected to the pitch. So yeah, very, very flexible piece of software. So hopefully that kind of clears it up a little bit, just to kind of, ADSR, just remember that. ADSR. So attack refers to how long it takes for the sound to reach its maximum volume on the envelope. And it's a term that's described in milliseconds, right? It's a time term, okay? I think I have this on the OneNote. So if I go to, I think I might have discussed it in the context of analog. Well, no, I discussed it in terms of simpler. That was the first thing we talked about. So attack is in terms of time, how long it takes to get to the loudest volume. Decay refers to how long it takes to get to the sustained level. So decay is a time as well. Sustain is a level, because it's saying how long does the sound take before it gets to this particular level, okay? And then release is how long it takes for the sound to go to nothing after you release the key. So it's important to recognize that attack and decay and release are all time values, units of time, but the sustain is a level. It's actually a volume, a unit of volume. So just remember ADSR. Like there's a website called ADSR. There's many YouTube channels that reference this concept, or maybe there aren't, but it's so common. Just remember this acronym, so you remember the order. Just don't forget ADSR. And if you remember that, because I always get confused, I'm like, what happens first? Is it the sustain or is it the attack? If you remember this, you won't get confused. And that's really important. So that's basically just when we were controlling these envelopes, if you want to control them using values instead of actually graphically pulling them down, you could interpret this as values in terms of those 4 terms: attack, decay, sustain, release, instead of just interpreting them as a graph. They're both one and the same. So hopefully that clears up a little bit about filters and envelopes. I remember last class, or some class recently, I stubbed my toe on filters, so I wanted to kind of go over this in more depth. All kinds of cool stuff you can do with it. And so just to kind of show the analog, so to speak, within analog, let's take a look. So, whoops, that's not what I want to do. Command-Shift-T. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll grab an analog over here. Fear not in sound design. Most of these things are very similar to one another. If you understand the principle of one, you understand principles of another. Just look for the appropriate menu item. And you got to figure out which envelope, what parameter the envelopes are affecting, right? So when I click this main oscillator 1 bank, basically oscillator 1 section, this envelope is affecting the pitch, right? Right? Oscillator 2 is on as well, right? You could turn it off. You just hear that little squeaky oscillator 1 sound, right? Now, if we go to the filter, you're going to see an envelope again, right? So this hopefully is less intimidating now. So at some level, what you're going to experience is the same exact thing. You have independent control over the filter sound that you do over the amplitude envelope. So the amplitude envelope refers to, basically refers on an oscillator by oscillator. Well, actually, in this particular synthesizer, it's on a global basis. You can adjust the, no, it's not. Sorry. On this particular device, you can actually adjust the amplitude envelope over here of this oscillator, and you can adjust the filter envelope of this oscillator over here. But what's complicated about this filter is it can actually affect the other oscillator as well. That's what makes this a little bit more interesting and more complicated. Because unlike operator, there are actually 2 filters in analog. So you could do different combinations of filtering, essentially. So if we were to try to recreate what we did earlier, for one thing, remember, this simulates the idea that the filter is opening up over time. You have a baseline, right? The baseline is set by this value, this frequency value. So if I set this up here, the filter is going to open up even more, but we're not going to hear it because it's outside of the range of human hearing, right? That's why when we looked at this on the waveform, you know, I think it was Jarrett who suggested pulling down this frequency knob. The reason this is important is because it's funny, before we pulled down the frequency knob, we saw changes in the waveform. So for instance, let me actually pull up a waveform, this spectrum analyzer, or I guess I can use the same thing. I'll go to audio effects. No, sorry, plugins. This is my own thing that I downloaded, but you can download this as well. So for instance, well, what I was trying to show you is the filter might still be acting on the sound, but we just can't hear it. So for instance, to kind of maybe demonstrate that, I'll see if this is actually the case. I thought I was able to recreate this. Let's just take a look at this. Let me actually turn off the pitch envelope. So you see how the filter is opening up? So over here, you actually do see the filter opening up a little bit, right? You see a little bit of movement going to the right, but that's too high-pitched for us to even perceive, right? But if we actually lower this this cutoff, you can see it's opening up over time, right? And you can set the time, just as we talked about, by determining the attack time. So now it'll open up slower. Right? Same exact mechanic as operator, right? So really what I hope you take away from this class is a framework in which to apply these concepts to any synthesizer you ever run into. Because, you know, I had a professor joke. I was like, hey, is this like, I was showing him an article like from the 50s about like music physics. And I was like, is this still up to date? And he joked, he was like, physics hasn't changed. And in the same way, like these techniques haven't changed. Like ultimately you're going to have to use these exact little building blocks to construct your sound. Whether you use serum or whether you use wavetable, you're ultimately going to have an oscillator, you're going to have a filter, you're going to have an amplifier, and it's just really the way that these particular things are routed that determine that particular plugin that you're working with. So, you know, the LFO also exists for this, right? You have to work on how this gets routed, right? So in operator, the routing existed where you saw the routing directly in the global section, right? For the LFO. Here, you actually see the LFO routing within the oscillator itself, right? So those are the little differences that actually affect the plugin design, but they shouldn't affect the sound that you can get. I mean, they will affect the sound you get because of the way it's constrained by the possibilities of routing that you're given. But ultimately, if I threw any plugin at you, theoretically, if you understand these big three, analog, operator, and wavetable, you will, if you spend enough time, even without looking at a manual, I bet you could figure these plugins out. So any questions about any of this stuff? I know that I've been talking a lot. If there's any specific questions about these devices, very, very powerful, interesting possibilities. I guess I will show you, you know, since we're on the subject of the big three, the three starting Pokemon, really all you need if you get them evolved enough. But let's see. I keep going to the wrong menu. I have to go to Instruments to find Wavetable. Drag this on, and Wavetable, we've talked about the filtering components. We've talked about how basically this you're basically opening up the filter over time. So Wavetable you can actually visualize this. So if I expose this matrix, right? Also a movie. If I expose it this way, where I can actually see everything up here, and I'm going to close this oscilloscope, or I'll move the oscilloscope. What I basically see are the amplitude envelope and some other additional envelopes that are available to me, and some LFOs that are available to me. So then it's really, the choice is mine in how I use these modulating, these modulators essentially, to affect parameters. So for instance, this is a modulator because I can affect a parameter over time using the shape, right? So what if I wanted to modulate the filter cutoff using this envelope? Well, we know how to do it in analog. We know how to do it in operator. How do we do it in here? Well, let's do it. So what we want to do is we want to map maybe filter one frequency, which refers to the cutoff frequency, right? Because as I lower this frequency, it's the cutoff frequency. I'm going to map it to envelope 2, 100%. And in fact, right now this is so high that it actually can't go any further. So let's lower it. You saw how that happened? This is kind of confirming what we were talking about earlier. The filter definitely opens in this direction, but if you have it all the way, if you have it so that it can't open any further, it can't really open any further, and so you won't graphically see it. But Wavetable will actually show you the envelope opening as you change the attack. It's kind of a cooler effect with sounds that are more buzzy. You also see the, isn't that cool? You see that little sine wave become a square wave because essentially when you're filtering a square wave, remember how earlier, okay, this is kind of cool. Remember how earlier we were talking about operator? And we were talking about how these different, depending on the type of waveform you use, there are more or less harmonics. Well, it's only logical. Like if you have one of these waveforms right here, and you're filtering out all of these frequencies, you're only going to be left with a sine wave, which is why when you actually filter, like we did over here, over time, the sine wave is becoming a square wave because you're filtering it out. You're filtering out all those high frequencies in the signal, and that's interesting, right? So if you filter, long story short, if you filter a square wave, if you filter it using a low pass filter, like we have over here, or a high cut filter, you will end up with a sine wave. Pretty cool. Science is awesome, right? So essentially, same sort of stuff that you can access in all three of these synthesizers. Again, the routing is different. The means for applying these different modulators is different. The mechanism for applying these different modulators is different, is what I could also say. And that really might determine which one you kind of lean on the most. So for instance, one of the reasons, just to recap, one of the reasons that people really like this device, and the reason people like Massive, and maybe Serum works the same way, is that it allows you to visually have this matrix, or it allows you to basically map parameters onto modulators in a way that you can visually see the changes happen in real time. So here are the parameters and here are the modulators. And so for instance, I could map it so that filter one frequency being affected by the modulator, which is the LFO, right? I could have the pitch, which is the parameter, being modulated by an envelope. Right? So it's really, really powerful, the kind of stuff you can do with synthesis, but they're all, there's similarities between all these paradigms. This was actually totally an aside, but I think it's worth talking about this in greater depth. This turned into a much bigger aside than I thought it was going to be. I didn't even have it on my daily thing. So let's go on to some of the other stuff. So I have this track, right? I'll delete some of these tracks right here. The reason I wanted to spend so much time on this is I think it's really important to not be intimidated by these different types of synthesis and to recognize that they're all basically doing the same thing. You just have to understand the fundamental principles and you'll be able to apply them to whatever environment you're in. So one thing that I could talk about, oh, Chris is here. So this is something that I wanted to mention since Chris is here. There's this really cool thing called mid-side EQing. And I noticed Chris did something like this on his track using a different means. What Chris, I saw do on his track was basically send his bass track so that it was only in mono. And the reason that people do this is if you're in a club, or in general, from a psychoacoustic standpoint, our brain has difficulty spatializing low frequencies. So, and that has to do with the distance between here's an interesting factoid. The wavelength between our two eardrums is the limit to which we can spatialize frequencies. So if we have, like for instance, if you hear a sound, you know that it's coming from the right or the left based on which eardrum it hits first. But if you have a sound whose wavelength is bigger than the distance between our eardrums, our ear doesn't know which ear it hit first because the wave is actually bigger than the distance between our eardrums. So the implication of that is our brain has difficulties in spatializing lower frequencies. So if you actually do spatialize lower frequencies, it actually sounds wrong. And it will actually, you'll end up getting these cancellations that you don't want. Especially when you are collapsing to mono. When you collapse your signal to mono, it's problematic. So what I saw Chris do on his track was he had a bass sound, or maybe it was more than a bass sound, and he sent it basically.
It was the sub bass and the kick drum.
The sub bass and the kick drum. Okay, so just to recreate what he did on my track, basically there's many ways you can do this. So I think I've got a bass right here. Okay, so actually there are a couple ways you can do this. One way is he used a send track to do what he wanted to do, and there's benefits to doing that. I'll show you a couple of different ways to do it. So one of the simplest thing you can do is to go into utility and go into audio effects, drop this utility in here, and there's actually a function called bass mono. And I think this wasn't there in Live 9, but you can just do this and it'll basically set bass to be in mono. What this will do actually, versus mono, is bass mono will only allow the low frequencies of that signal to be in mono, but it'll allow all of the higher frequencies to be in stereo. So if you have a really dynamic, beautiful, like lush bass sound that has a lot of harmonics, you might want the harmonics of that bass sound to be on the sides, but you want the low frequencies to be in mono, meaning you want them to be in the center, okay? So you could do it both ways. If you're just worried that you just don't necessarily trust what the cutoff of the filter is, you could just put in mono and the entire bass sound will be in mono. So that is a consideration a lot of people use. They want, you pan all your instruments wherever they may be, but your bass frequencies need to be in mono, because if you have a stereo track, it might be fine, but it's still if the real problem is when you collapse it to mono and you're in a club, the bass, there might be some frequency cancellations. It's just good practice to collapse your sound, your bass frequencies to mono. So you could do it this way, but you can also use a return track. So for instance, this is what Chris did. He created an auxiliary return track, and he called it, my return tracks are missing. Oh, here they are. Okay. Incidentally, if you lose things routing wise, you can click these little buttons, right? So now this particular return, I guess I'll rename this return track bass mono. And I guess what you could do is, I believe he put the utility here and he put it in mono mode. And then what he did, he's right here so we can confirm it in real time. But what he did was he sent the return. You did something like this, right, Chris?
Yeah, I sent them the full send to 0, and then I put it on sends only instead of master out.
Oh, okay. So you put it on sends only. So you just, okay. There's two things you can do. I've seen some people do this, but then I've seen some people also, I don't know if this is good or bad, but they'll have a parallel kind of scenario going on, where they'll have like the non-bass mono here, and then they'll have the bass.
Yeah, that's I think that's called parallel compression or parallel mixing.
Yeah, exactly. It's
like
parallel.
Like for parallel compression, you'll have like a return track with a almost kind of over compressed version, and you mix the over compressed version in with the uncompressed one.
That's right, and they call that that type of compression is sometimes referred to as New York compression. It's a very effective thing. We can talk about that too. So that is, but essentially, what this that's definitely worth talking about. But what this workflow allows you to do is it allows you to basically cut out the lows of your sound. But there is another way to do that, and there's a mid-side.
It's really good because you don't have to put a mono on like 5 different things that eats up your processing power. So like it's good to just have one plugin that's operating on 5 tracks that got collapsed down instead of 5 separate monos.
That's true, actually. Yeah, you could actually, because you might have low frequency. Yeah, so you sent your kick and your bass to that return track, and you could put on bass mono mode or mono mode depending on how stringent you want to make it mono. But another thing you can do to get more surgical with the process is the EQ actually has a mid-side EQ mode. So when you open the EQ, by default, the EQ opens in stereo mode. But if you go to mid-side mode, what you can do is you can have a different EQ curve for your mids, which is the center, which you want to be the center frequencies, and versus the side frequencies. So an equivalent way you can do to make this bass frequency be mono is you can put a curve here where you cut out all low frequencies in the sides. So you're cutting out all the low frequencies in the sides, which are basically causing it so that the low frequencies are not getting spatialized and getting weirdly treated. And this is cool. This mode is really cool because you have surgical control over the cutoff frequency of where you want the cutoff to happen. Because
that seems like the better way to do it. Honestly, I didn't know about that.
It's really cool. I recently learned about this. This is cool because a lot of this whole mid-side mixing thing is a more recent phenomenon, and people like it because they don't want to cut out all the higher frequencies of their bass sound. They want to keep the resonance and the ring, but they want to make sure the sub and all of the low components are well contained. So this is an interesting. There's so many workflows. Like if you just want to just slap on it, there's so many ways to achieve the same thing. But you could do this too, and you could also have this on a return track. You could, instead of the utility, and then you could send it to this particular track. So it's very interesting a way to get your mix to sound a little cleaner, especially in the low frequencies. Especially when you're in a club situation where you want your bass to be heard and not phase canceled and all this stuff, right? So that is what I want to say about mid-side EQ. Now, this particular track actually has, we talked about gating last time, but I didn't get a chance to talk about everything I want to talk about with gating last time. So this particular track that I have, there's a part in the track where it actually there's this kind of pulsing gating sound. Over here. So the way you get this particular gating sound, it's pretty cool. So what you do, the way I got this particular effect was I use sidechain gating, and so the way I did this, it's funny. I forgot I did this, and if I don't use a technique for a little while, I forget about it and I have to like re-research it. And so I had this on a track from a long time ago, and what I basically did, I had to think about it, is I had this particular MIDI track that was causing the gate. So I had these particular MIDI notes. If I actually solo these MIDI notes, they sound like this. But I'm actually what's cool about it is I'm actually turning off this signal. I'm turning off the signal, so I'm not actually hearing this particular sound. But these particular notes are actually triggering the the gate to turn on and off. And actually, I have a little section on the OneNote about this. So if I go to gate, sidechain gate, causing the gate to be triggered by silent signals. So what basically is happening, you're constructing a MIDI clip on the sidechain track in order to pattern the gate to open and close in a rhythmic way. And what that means is it's basically following this exact kind of rhythm. The gate is following this rhythm. And so what you got to do is, well, you want to turn off, like I just showed you, you want to turn off the audio from this particular track that's causing the gating. Because you don't want to hear the signal, but you just want to, you don't want to hear the sidechain signal, you just want to hear this, you just want this to cause the sidechaining. You just want the sidechain signal to cause the gating, but you don't want to hear the sidechain signal. So you turn this off. And then what you do on the track that you want to sidechain the signal to, you basically open up the sidechain menu and you select this particular track. And now basically what happens is the gate, remember, is basically allowing, what's happening is the gate only allows sound to enter when it's reached a certain, when the sound is at a certain threshold. So by default, no sound is coming in until the sound from this track is coming in. So when the sound from this sidechain track is coming in, that's causing the gate on the other track to open up. So you actually hear sound come in. So you can cause a lot of rhythmic, interesting rhythmic things to occur that way. So for instance, I patterned the MIDI notes in this particular way, but I could have patterned it in a totally different way. This gives you flexibility to like create this pumping effect in a very specific manner. And you could technically do this with sidechain compression and all this stuff, and if you flip the mode, but this is the most straightforward way to do it, by using a sidechain gate. And I think it's the most control-rich way of doing it. So just to kind of walk through it again, I have this little MIDI signal. I could actually cause many different notes. It doesn't even matter what pitches I choose, right? Because ultimately, it's just right here. Right here, it's struggling because it's actually, you know, I could do something like this. So getting back into it, right out the gate, we're going to go back to the gate, the track with the gate, which is this pad. Because without the gate, listen to how it sounds much more boring, I think, without the gate. With the gate, now, just to kind of review the gate a little bit, let's take a look. Chat. Oh, thank you. Sure, the kind words. Okay, so what I see here is the gate. Now, don't be intimidated by the gate. There's so many different controls on this instrument that all affect the gate in some ways in the same way, but using different different units. So here you can affect the gate using time. Here you can affect the gate using volume. That's the basic principle of the gate. And they both can have the same effect. You could affect the gate using time and have the same effect as if you use the gate and affected the gate using volume. So essentially, if you use volume, what the threshold really refers to is basically saying that anything below this level will not come through the gate. Okay? That's like the most extreme, severe use of the gate. Nothing below this threshold will come through the gate. So I could set this threshold higher. Right? And now some of these other sounds are coming through. But like that's another really important thing. You might do this whole sidechain thing and you're like, why can't, I'm hearing everything. Well, you have to set the threshold so that only some of the notes are, only the rhythmic aspect of those, the attacks of those notes are coming through. Right? So that's pretty severe. Now, if I increase the return value, that means it's basically determining the level differential I can accept once the gate is open. So for instance, the gate opens, sound comes through, and then as long as volume is anywhere above this line, after the gate opens, it'll still come through. Which is actually not what I want. I want something really severe. I want.
What does floor do again?
Floor basically, okay, so a gain is a gain does a fixed reduction of a gate does a fixed gain reduction. Unlike an expander actually does a proportional gain reduction. So what that means is, like, you know, you think about a compressor, as you approach this, as you go above the threshold, you squash down the signal by some ratio, right? But the gate actually does it by like some decibel amount. It doesn't do it by threshold, by some proportion. It just reduces the value by that amount. So if you have the floor at -40, that's basically saying the softest, it's basically subtracting everything that's above this, like anything that's below this line is being subtracted by 40 decibels. If you set this to infinity, I mean, that's practically infinity. Like, you're not going to hear anything because 40 decibels is a lot of gain reduction. But you could set it so that it's not doing much gain reduction. So for instance, this is something you might want to mess around with. You might have it do this.
I understand it.
So this is a creative application of it. So you could open this over time. So like that, it's kind of a cool way to. Some people they automate the floor towards the end of a spot. Like right here, this is the most intense part of the piece right here, I think, or this most intense part of this section. So this part right here, as I get to the pad section, I will be at the gate and I'll do. It's becoming more sustained over time, right? On the flip side of the gate, you can actually invert it so that it only, the gate, it's sidechained right now, but it only plays whenever the sound isn't coming in.
If you ever get a chance, I would like to know about expanders, like dimension expanders.
Okay, yeah, expanders are really similar conceptually. Like, I think, you know, I was thinking of actually talking about it today. We'll see how we're doing on time. I was going to talk about multi-band dynamics, which is basically a catch-all for all four. So if you go to the mixing section of the OneNote, it actually has, it shows you how the multi-band dynamics can accomplish both downwards, upwards compression, as well as upwards expansion and downwards expansion, depending on how you set the parameters. So what's happening in expansion, I was talking about it a little bit last time, is that in the case of downward expansion, well, a gate is basically very similar to downward expansion, meaning you start out with all this dynamic range where everything is equal. And then as you go below this threshold, you're saying, no. Let's completely squash this range so that we get all the way to, we're going to squash this range, right? That's basically what's happening. So basically anything below this threshold is getting softer. Let me rephrase that. I want to say that whole sentence again. An expander increases dynamic range because what's happening is you're making the softer things softer in this case. Like this gate is actually, algorithmically speaking, probably doing something very similar to this, where you get below a certain threshold, it's making something softer. So that's actually increasing the dynamic range because the louder things are getting louder. I mean, the louder things are just as loud as they were before, but the softer things are now softer, which in turn increases the dynamic range. So that's the conceptual idea behind an expander.
So it's a form of gating?
Well, a gate is, okay, so so this graph applies to an expander as well. Sorry, this graph applies to a gate as well. But over here, there's a proportional gain reduction. So for instance, like, let me see if I can draw another shape here.
Like a 2-to-1 ratio or a 3-to-1
Exactly,
ratio.
exactly. So let me see if, okay. So maybe I can do this. No, not that. I want to see if I can adjust the vertex of this. No, I can't do it. So basically anything below this threshold gets attenuated. In an expander, it gets attenuated by some ratio. In a gate, it just gets attenuated by some fixed amount, which is 40 decibels. So it's like, oh, you're below this line? Okay, now you're 40 decibels from where you were before. Oh, you're below this line? Now you're infinitely lower than where you were before. It's like almost like a really, really hard limiter, but it's like in the other direction. It's like it's a limiter, except you're increasing dynamic range. It's probably conceptually the best way I can talk about it. So let's see. You can hold Alt while dragging objects, and it won't auto place things if that's what you were trying to do. Okay, so let me see what you were saying. So for instance, if I create this, well, what do you mean? You can hold Alt while dragging objects, and it won't auto place things. Can you speak into the microphone? Because I'm curious. I'm a one-note obsessed person, so I want to know the secret. I think you're being gated right now.
Hello?
Oh, I can hear you now.
Wait, so what were you trying to do? That vertex was what?
Oh, I was trying to, I don't know if it's a function of the shape. I was trying to basically move this. I think it might be impossible. I was trying to change the shape of this object. Maybe I need to use a square, because I kind of want a square but like the other sides are invisible, but like it's not letting me do it. Like I want to basically do this, where I like can change that, but it doesn't seem to have the, oh, I guess you can do this, but I can't change this. I have to like change. I guess you could still accomplish it, but.
Okay, I wasn't quite sure. Okay.
Yeah, OneNote can be a little fussy, but yeah, if you have any suggestions, I'm always interested in learning about this stuff and more about it, because I use it so much. But so if we get back to this particular aspect of gating, and we just, I just want to review it just a little bit more in terms of the pads. If you see the pads, you see the gate. We're adjusting basically how long the gate stays open in terms of volume, but we can also adjust how long the gate stays open in terms of time. So like it just depends on how you want to work. Like you're like, oh, I want it to stay open for this volume. Like as long as it's this many 8 decibels softer than the threshold, I want it to stay open. But I could also say, as long as I just want it to stay on for like 10 seconds. So. It really depends. And like the flip mode is cool because it just flips the behavior. So the cool thing about flip is like you could, you know how these are really percussive things? I could have it kind of like, it's like a ducker. It's basically ducking out and just coming in. So you can have like for instance, if I mess, it might be cooler if this is problematic because this is a piano sound, so it won't sustain. But if this weren't a piano sound, you can imagine where it like, every time that this happened, it would just come in afterwards. So it's kind of a cool way to fill in the sound. It's kind of like sidechain compression at that point. When you flip a gate, you're kind of doing that sidechain compression kind of thing, which I still have to make a OneNote thing on. I haven't forgotten, but I did make a sidechain gate, but I got sidechained, so to speak. So I will try to add that soon. And but that's what I have to say about the gate. Okay. Groove. This is okay. So I want to talk to you a little bit about level. So sometimes in terms of level, it's good to have a sense for what someone else does. So like Skrillex, like Skrillex has a lot of dubstep. This isn't quite dubstep. I don't know what it is. I don't know what. I'm really bad at describing my own music, and I think everyone kind of. It's the wrong focus. It's just you make music, but when you are trying to figure out levels, relative levels, sometimes it's useful to find a reference track to work off. So like, you know, everyone probably knows this Skrillex track, Scary Monsters and Nice Sprites. Right? So I actually examined, I looked at what Skrillex did in terms of volume here. I opened up my mastering plugin, and I tried to figure out what the peak level was and what the average level was. And he was actually pretty
Did
spot
that guy send us ozone?
Oh, I don't know if he sent ozone, but I'm sure he can. Last time I talked to him, I think he had ozone.
Can you tell him to send me ozone, please?
I will tell him. I will tell him, and then I'll slap him on the wrist. I'll tell him not to, in fact.
All right.
I think that guy also has Melodyne too. Melodyne is incredible for, I was speaking to Adil about it. Oh, okay. Okay. You know what? I saw something in the chat about Omnisphere too. So no fear, Omnisphere. I will tell this guy, I will slap him on the wrist. So essentially what you can do with this plugin, what it's showing me right here is it's showing me the levels that Skrillex was at. And he's basically saying that the level was, what you see is you see the peaks being -1 around either minus 0.8 or minus 1.2 for the peak, which is pretty much industry standard for the peak levels, because like you have to bake in a little bit of room for MP3s, because MP3s overload if you get too close to 0. So, you know, having like -1 is, or minus 0.8 is like a good strategy in terms of where to set the ceiling, because like, you know, uncompressed files like waves can handle a little bit more headroom than compressed files like MP3s. But then notice the average level is somewhere around -6 decibels, the RMS. And that's also like a good rule of thumb in terms of like getting your loudness correct. For this particular track, it seems to fit the guidelines pretty well. But keep in mind, if the average is really consistent, you have a compressed track, because in general, if the average isn't changing too much, the dynamic range is pretty consistent throughout the entire track, and you don't really have much dynamic range to begin with. But, you know, certain styles are characteristic of that. So this is a good way to test how your music is in relation to other music.
When they say like you're supposed to be mixing at -12 to -8, that's before you mix down and master it, right?
That's before you mix down and master it. So
when you're mastering, what you're shooting for, like close to a reference track, you're saying like -1, -1.5 is about industry standard.
Well, minus 0.8 actually. I think if we keep listening to this, I think it'll sometimes I think that's the maximum it ever hits. I think.
And then I know like also though it's important like what your minimum level is and your like what the range of your levels is, so to speak. Is there like an industry standard for that too?
That really is genre dependent. Like meaning like what's the softest and what's the loudest?
Because, right, like a really compressed track with like a pretty small range, or like just no bound on it.
I don't think there's any bound on it, because I think this kind of genre is probably the most compressed you're gonna find, because it's so in your face. And
but so, like a lot of these guys, like they'll limit it, right, to try to make it sound louder.
Yeah, they'll limit it as well.
So like you'll put a limiter at -0.8.
Yes, you'll put
kind of what you'll do, and then just add gain.
Yeah, you'll put the ceiling at -0.8. If you have a maximizer plugin, it'll do the compensation for you. But
yeah, the maximizer is, that's what I usually use, is the maximizer in Ozone. But like, what exactly is that doing? Is it a form of, it's a form of limiting, I know that, but like what's the difference between that and the stock plugin that comes in Ableton that's a limiter?
I don't think there's any difference, to be honest. I think it's the same thing. It's you know, the limiter within Ableton, just to kind of recreate this without Ozone. is to, I can drag this on here.
So it's saying anything below -2 gets a gain?
The
Is that
threshold.
what the threshold is in this case?
The threshold is going to affect the amount of compression. So I think anything below, so like we can listen to this and check it out. So this is actually going to affect, it's going to, as you lower this, you're actually going to increase the average, the RMS value. Like the peaks will always be over, the true peak will always be around here. But as you lower this, you're gonna compress the sound even more in order to get the average louder. Because like this is only pertaining to the peak value, but if you want to actually get the RMS value up, you actually have to lower the threshold, and that's like another component of the limiting.
But I'm saying like the stock one, you just turn a gain knob.
Yeah, so that would be the equivalent. So the gain knob for this would be that for
is the threshold.
Yeah, exactly. So it's basically like you're kind of pumping it, and I mean that's the closest analog you can think about. So that Skrillex even more compressed than it already is. But it's funny, you can hardly hear a difference because it's been so compressed to begin with. It's like its dynamic ranges. You just look at the waveforms; they're just sausages. They're like so consistent. Like it's not changing much. So for this particular genre, it's ultra compressed. But here's the thing about mixing versus mastering, because people do both in the box. So for mixing, like you leave a lot of headroom. Like your average could be anywhere from like 12 decibels to -14 or -12 instead of -6, and your peak could go to like -6 or something. But it's a good practice to still get your sound good before you master, because you don't want it to be super compressed before you master, because then because sometimes the limiting, like if you don't set all the levels correctly, the limiting could actually make your sound super over compressed. Like if you're really putting your track in here and then you're lowering the threshold all the way down here just to get the average level higher, or just to do this just to get the average level higher, you're probably going to distort and it'll sound bad. So like it's probably better to have it where you don't have to affect the gain so much and just use the ceiling. It's just basically you want to.
I mean, I don't try to like I never try to overdo it, but it's still kind of like you got to push it from the -8 zone to like the -1 zone. And I guess that's all done with multi-band compression and then the maximizer.
Yeah, exactly. So you can do that. It's just tread with caution as you're moving. I guess general advice for everyone would be, as you're moving from mixing, as you're moving to the mastering stage, just be aware of the adage limiters limit, and that's a pejorative connotation on limiters, because you're basically some level, if you're just squashing down the dynamic range excessively without enough careful detail, you might end up adding some harsh compression that you don't necessarily want. So it's kind of good to stage everything. That's why there's a mixing stage and a mastering stage, that it's just not choking up and you just have this very choked kind of sounding mix. But it's a deep subject. But I guess in terms of levels, just be aware of those levels for mastering. Ceiling could be -0.8, and then the average can be -6. But then as for great practice, just bring in a track you like, push it in, put it into Ableton, and you'll appreciate it. You'll have a better understanding of how to move forward once you see a reference track. There are diagnostic tools within Ozone, for instance, that make certain things easier to understand. So for instance, if I open up Ozone, there's a plugin called Dynamic what's it called? It's not called, oh, tonal balance control. So tonal balance control basically gives you a spectral idea of how your track is. Huh, it's not working right now. Maybe I have to put it, maybe it's because there's two ozones. Let me put it over here. Let me drag on tonal balance control 1. I don't know why it's struggling right now, but basically what it'll show you is it'll show you a projected lookup of what the different frequencies, like where you might improve the frequency balance of your track. You know what? It might be because there's already an ozone on here, so I think I can just add a module, perhaps. It's not working for right now for whatever reason. Let me try putting on the master, just to get a better sense. I don't know why it's not working right now. Something weird's going on. Oh, ozone? No, there's something fishy going on here. But anyway, all I wanted to show you that plugin was to kind of illustrate how you could basically see how your mix stands against other relative mixes of that particular genre, approximate genre that you're working in. But I guess this is a good time to talk about, I still haven't talked about session view, but it's okay. This might be a good time to talk about multiband dynamics. Multiband dynamics is a very interesting plugin within Ableton. So actually, let's see. In fact, why don't we take a 10-minute break? We'll start again at 12:50, just so you guys can process all this a little bit more. And we could start up in a little bit.
Professor?
Sure.
Before you leave, is the Thursday's YouTube video still not up?
Oh, it's not up?
Yeah, it says deleted video.
Oh, really?
And it says, I thought it was still processing because that's what it says. Like, oh, it's still processing. So I was like waiting. But was Thursday's lecture by any chance when you talked about return tracks?
No, but I could talk about return tracks. Someone else had a question about return tracks too. Yeah, no, I think it was when we talked about return tracks.
Because I wasn't quite sure, so I like just used master track, and I wasn't sure if that was.
Yeah, let's talk about that. It's a bummer that it didn't upload. If just keep bothering me if it's not uploading. I will upload it. I don't know why that didn't work, but I'll upload it after class today. That's a bummer, but thanks for letting me know.
No problem. I kind of informed you a little late.
No worries.
Yeah.
Okay. Well.
When is the final project due?
The final project, I think I'm going to make it. Is there a finals week for summer session?
It's not even finals week. It's like finals weekend. It's like
week 5.
This is week 5. So that means it's. So I guess this is finals week.
I feel like I'm not sure, but we might be able to turn in like Sunday.
Well,
okay.
I mean, they're what they say is it's not finals week. It's like finals weekend. It's like the finals is between like Saturday and Sunday.
Okay.
Oh, right. Yeah, it says Friday through.
Or yeah, Friday.
I see. Well, I mean, okay. Here's the deal. You should already have a pretty good idea of what your track. On Thursday, we're going to listen to everyone's track, like a track that they want us to listen to, and then maybe you could turn it in on Saturday. And then I could grade it on Sunday and then input grades. But yeah, everyone should, we'll spend most of class time on, if not all of class time, just listening and deconstructing tracks on Thursday. And that's what we will do So Saturday we'll just make the final assignment due.
Will be like the final assignment format? Like, will it be like 4 minutes this time? Like, will it be combining all stuff? Like,
I think it'll be like a minimum of 2 minutes. As much as you can do in that regard.
And can we rework a homework assignment for our final project?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, totally.
sick.
You could totally reuse, reincorporate anything you've done, and even I've even allowed students to do that for homework assignments in general, like rework a previous homework assignment, either add new stuff or extremely revamp, renovate what you've already done. But yeah, totally. So don't stress out about it too much. Just it's just getting you in the mindset of making a full track.
and finally, like, what are the stuff that's like minimum you expect us to put in? Like, just all the stuff that we've used before for the past 3 assignments, or is it just kind of really up to you?
It's really, I guess at this particular point, it's whatever you want. It's just your music, so it's like I won't have any constraints on what you need to include for this final track.
Okay.
Looking forward to hearing it.
Remix someone else's track, right? Because we have access to everyone's Google Drive.
You totally could. And actually, the way King Britt taught it, it was, I mean, he had the opportunity, a longer class session. You could totally remix someone's track. I mean, I'm sure everyone would be flattered, but if you're worried that they wouldn't, just email them and be like, hey, I want to remix your track. And that was actually, if the class was longer, that was actually a component of King's syllabus. That would be really cool. So if that's something you want to do, that would be awesome. And I'd love to hear that. Cool. Well, I will be back in a few minutes and just process all this information and see you soon. Okay. All right. I'm just asking for people to start their videos. And all righty. Okay. Here we are. All right. So I think this might be a good time to talk about groove. Groove is really interesting. It's like it basically allows you to introduce some human timing back into your track. So the most simple way to talk about groove is probably by just taking a MIDI clip and applying a groove to it. So for instance, let's just find the drums, for instance. I'll just loop it. Right? There's some drum stuff going on right here, right? I think I might have even added a sidechain gate to these drums from last time. I'm not 100% sure. I think that I did, and I saved it, and I think they're here. I'll just double check to make sure if that's indeed the case. Oh yeah, I guess I did do a sidechain gate. Okay, so essentially, in order to work with grooves, you have to look for the grooves, and I always forget where the grooves are. But essentially, this thing right here, the groove pool, if you click these little wiggly equal lines, approximately equal symbol, that's the groove pool. And maybe the symbol is a little telling in terms of what a groove really is. It's kind of shaping a sound to kind of mirror another sound in terms of feel. So you can kind of superimpose a different feel over your existing drums to kind of make them a little looser, or to make them a little drunk sounding, or to it's a really cool way to kind of add some life to your drums if they sound superly overly quantized, or if you type them in without some like velocity information, so they sound too rigid and like without feeling. Grooves are really cool. And I believe the place the grooves are, I'm going to search groove. Sound. See, Ableton unfortunately doesn't have like a nice category for grooves, as far as I know. So I always have to, you have to look for them in the user library, I believe.
Yeah, if you scroll down, there's an entire category there. I can't remember what it is, but I think it's under, it's either under packs or user library, but one of those should have a specific grooves.
Here we go. It's under user library, but it's not, it's empty. Why is that empty? Sorry guys, let's figure out where the grooves are.
I think maybe chop and swing. I think because I think swing is pretty much the same thing, right?
Where did you see that?
I think under packs or under user library.
No, these are just kits. These are drum kits.
I used one in homework 3, so let me actually open that up and see if I can find it.
Cool. Oh. Well, let's do a little Google search. Oh, I think you can right-click here and browse Groove Library. So it is under. Okay. Okay, this is so ridiculous that you have to do this. You basically, it's under like the most non-obvious place. You have to go to Chord Library, you have to go to Swing and Groove. All you have to do is right-click where it says Drop Clips or Grooves, and click Browse Groove Library. And what this allows you to do is to see all of the different grooves that are available to you. So let's say I have, these are different hip-hop sounds, and these are actually little wave files. And you have a certain feel to it. So there's a little bit of swing, right? So let's say you want to apply the swing from this particular groove onto my particular dubstep track. So I can drag this down here, and this is in the groove pool. Now this groove is available to me wherever I am working in Ableton. So for instance, I have this drum rack right here, and you could see the particular, in fact, I don't have a groove right here, but let's say I have particular velocity here, right? Particular velocity pattern of how I inputted the drums. Well, I could select this NY cut groove in the clip editor, and what I have now is this groove superimposed on top of my drums. Now you can't actually see it reflected in the MIDI editor until you click commit, but when you click commit, you actually change the MIDI destructively where you can't get it back. You can see that, right? So what I like to do is I like clicking commit and just pressing undo so I can see what the groove is doing. Like you could see that the groove is basically moving the timing around a little bit, right? So that may or may not be what we want in that particular scenario. Let's try a breakbeat. Let's see how this groove affects. So let's add this groove to the groove pool. Let's just add a few grooves to the groove pool. Okay, and again, just to kind of visually see what's happening, I'm going to press commit. You notice how it not only moved some timings around, or it didn't move timings around. No, it did. It moved timings around, but it also made things a little softer. Okay. This is pretty subtle stuff, but let's see. It's not usually this subtle. Oh, this is more dramatic. So it actually completely humanized the drums in a way I was not expecting, and I think I destroyed my drums. Is it letting me? Oh no, okay, it's fine. Okay, I thought I couldn't undo. Is it all based on your grid quantization? As far as I can understand, let's take a look and see. So for instance, let's experiment with different quantizations. I believe it'll do the same thing no matter what, but we'll just see. For instance, right now I've got a whole bar quantization grid setting right here. So if I apply this really dramatic groove, which I think was logic 8 swing, it does quite a lot of stuff to it, right? Let's look ahead and see if it does the same amount of stuff. It still does the same dramatic move. So it actually doesn't have any dependence on the grid quantization. It does it basically, it has its own, basically what's happening actually is you're basically quantizing to the groove instead of quantizing to the grid. That's basically what's happening. You're basically shoving all of what you have into the framework of the groove. Yeah, so it's pretty interesting in that regard. So you can do really dramatic things. This is really cool. Let's say you have a really, let's just create a really boring, I'm not going to say it's a boring drum beat. I want to create like the first drum beat I created in class. It's Old Faithful, right? A very simple drum beat. Kick, snare, right? Hi-hat, whatever, right? It's really simple. I overdo it sometimes. So I'm like, how can I make this a little more interesting? So for instance, right here, I've got kick. We change my grid setting. Kick, snare, kick. Maybe just for fun, I will duplicate the loop, just so I have a little bit more stuff to work with. And I'll make my length adjust. Whoops. The loop is the correct length. It's just the clip itself is only showing part of it right now. Great. So now I'll loop this particular thing. I'll add some hi-hats in as well. So you might just add in some hi-hats, right? You might just be really simple and just go right? Actually, I'm gonna press the B tool, and then I can just draw them in like this. Ah, that's nice. That's the pencil tool. Actually, I'm gonna actually divide this all by 2. Multiply by 2. No, divide by 2. Now let's say I want to add some swing to that. Let's say I actually take my groove and I'll take this logic swing, see what it's doing. It just added some swing. Now, this is like a decent amount of swing, but there's so many different gradients of swing. Like looking at all the different groups they have, you might want this feel. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear my cat meowing, but he's doing it all right. Now the air conditioning's off, so you'll definitely hear it. All right. So now, that's a different kind of swing. So this gives it a little bit of humanness. Now, in the groove itself, you can actually say, I want some randomness. So now I'm going to commit that same groove with that randomness. So it gives it kind of a drunk kind of, if you listen to Questlove, right? There's a cool video by Adam Neely on this subject where he talks about the drunk groove. And Questlove did this thing, like a lot of hip hop, a lot of cool hip hop music, like Flying Lotus, for instance. It's got this really organic feel to it, where it doesn't feel like it's got it's kind of like delayed and anticipated, and it's got this really cool vibe to it. So like grooves, you know, we're so obsessed with being, you know, like in our boxes, right? In our specific metronomic boxes, but grooves can kind of add some humanness back into something that didn't have any at all. Oh yeah. Jacob Collier talks about that drunk groove as well as especially in D'Angelo's music. Absolutely, yes. It's become so common. This neo soul vibe. It's become so common to incorporate this, and music is better for it because, you know, there's this time when we would just be so like, oh, let's quantize this. Oh, let's just make it even smaller and we'll quantize that. But it's cool when we add some humanness to it. And so actually the groove itself, you can control how the groove, you control certain aspects of the groove in terms of, let me put it this way. You can describe how the groove interacts with the clip in these different manners. So actually, you remember, Jarrett, how we were talking about quantization? there is something else to this. So you can determine how the groove gets quantized, how the original clip gets quantized to the groove, the resolution at which that happens. So you could like quantize to the groove very frequently. We could see how that looks. It's actually not doing anything. It's not hardly doing anything, but if I do it less often, it's actually changing it quite dramatically. And that might be because it's, why would that happen? Let's see. That's interesting. So, I mean, these are things to explore in terms of the bass chooser determines the timing resolution against which the notes in the groove and the notes in any clips that use the groove will be measured. Okay. So what you can really do is you can influence certain amounts. Like you can influence how much quantization occurs. So maybe if we turn off quantization, let's see what happens. If we do this, and let's turn off random, and let's leave timing on. Right, now let's go to 30-second notes. Okay, so what does this tell you? Notice how nothing changed. What this is basically allowing you to do is it's allowing you to quantize the notes before they get affected by the groove. So you can quantize the notes to like 30-second notes before it gets groovified, essentially. That's basically what's happening. And then this affects how much the timing, this basically determines how much the timing of the clip is affected by the groove. So if you set this value low, the timing of the clip won't be affected by the groove at all. If you set this value high, the timing of the clip will be severely affected by the groove. In fact, we actually want to set this. You actually do. This is an important value to set because you want to look at 16th notes in this case. So now let's commit. Something's going wrong here. Give me a second here. Let's do a little more dramatic, okay? Let's take a listen. Okay, so we're going to take this Logic 8. I'm going to delete these other grooves. And I'm going to select Logic 8 sub up 65. We'll leave the bass the way it was. We'll turn quantize 8. We'll just leave timing all the way up. And we'll see what happens. You can see how it gets shifted dramatically, right? Like you're going from straight to swing. 2 partitions per thing to 3 partitions per thing. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, right? Let's lower timing to 0 and see what happens. Nothing changes, right? The timing of the clip is not affected by the groove. But if you leave timing all the way to 100, the timing of the clip is affected by the groove. The reason it wasn't working before is I think we had a straight groove and the straight groove wasn't doing anything to us. This is a straight kind of beat to begin with. So the straight groove wouldn't do anything to the straight beat if it's already straight, right? But this is a swung groove over a straight beat, okay? So let's see if we change these values, the 30-second notes, for instance, if it changes. It's not doing what we want. Basically, what we want to do is we want to apply the groove over to specific beats that we're interested in applying the groove to. So for this case, I've got 16th notes that I want to make swung, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I want to choose my bass to be 16th notes, I think. Or maybe 16th. Let's see if that works. Maybe it's 8th notes. You got to play around with this to find out to find out exactly what you're trying to accomplish. For me, I want to change something from straight to swung. So in this case, I guess 8th notes make sense because I'm changing 8th notes to unequal 8th notes. But wait a second. These are 16th notes, so no, these are 8th notes. My bad. My bad. I'm sorry. I'm confusing you guys. These are 8th notes. Because what we have here is beat 1, beat 2, beat 3, beat 4. Beat 1, beat 2, beat 3, beat 4, right? I'm dividing each of these into 2, which makes these 8th notes. If I had 1, it would be quarter notes. So what I want to do is I want to basically work at the 8th note level, essentially, like this. I'm working at the 8th note level and adjusting the timing of these notes at the 8th note level. Okay? So if I commit this, it'll do that. If I turn up random, it'll do that to some degree, but not completely. Right? Now you could manually tweak this and bring this in. You could have a different clip for each one. So you can have a different feeling for each different thing, like a live drummer would, right? You could also impact the loudness, how much the loudness of the particular groove impacts the loudness of the original groove, of the original clip. So the loudness of the groove, how much that will affect the loudness of the clip itself, like the different velocities of each note. So if I set this to 100%, every single velocity discrepancy, like loud and soft, of the groove will be applied to the original clip. So now look at how the velocities change dramatically, right? You see higher velocities, lower velocities, higher velocities. This gives your music a lot of feel, right? Because if it's all the same volume, it sounds boring. But if you change the velocity, it sounds a little more exciting. You could also go inverse. You could go at negative 100%, and then you could see it flips everything. Like it's just, the velocities are like totally flipped. But this is useful because we can listen to it now. I'll turn down random. Maybe random 12, 13%. Versus, oh, wait, the groove is still on. Versus, it has a lot more motion. It's very subtle, right? But there are a lot of things that are going on. The velocities are changing. The timings are changing. So you can change the velocity, you can change the timing. And just to kind of tie the bow on this, you're basically, the bass quantization determines how the timing, determines how the groove timing interacts with the clip timing. So if you set this number incorrectly, the groove won't apply correctly. So yeah, it's really context dependent on your musical material. So this bass thing is really important. So that first thing that Jarrett was talking about, like, oh, if you adjust the grid size, will that actually change? The way the groove interacts with the clip? No, that won't change it. We're still basically quantizing to the groove, but we're quantizing to the groove every 8th note or every 16th note or every 32nd note, basically. And the quantization, this determines the quantization you apply before even, you basically, if you adjust this value right here, you're basically quantizing the clip to whatever grid you select, and then you're applying the groove, which may or may not be what you want. So let's say like you played, your timing wasn't that great when you first played something. And then you actually want to both clean up your timing and transform the timing to be like maybe another style. Then you could turn quantize all the way up so that you're quantizing it and then you're applying the groove. you're like quantizing twice. You're quantizing to the grid, and then you're quantizing to the groove, if that makes sense. So what's really cool about this is you're not limited to using the grooves that are built in Ableton. You can actually take any audio file and make a groove out of it. This is like the mind-blowing thing. So for instance, we have the Skrillex track right here. Let's say I want to incorporate the feel of Skrillex track into my own drums. I could do that. The way I can do that is first I've got to make sure this is worked correctly. Let's see if this has actually worked correctly. Not quite. So it got confused, right? It got confused by this silence at the beginning. So we actually have to figure out where beat 1 is, okay? So we have to right-click here and click warp from here. And now it... And then I guess I could also just set the start point right here. Perfectly in sync, right? If I change the tempo. Okay, so now let's say I want to take the feel of Skrillex's music and make a groove out of it, okay? So let me wait till the drums come in. Shoot, what was the original tempo? I hope I didn't. Well, I have the tempo stored somewhere. Sorry. I got freaked out because I didn't want to lose my original track BPM. Okay, so let me just do that one more time. I will select warp and I will right click this and I will click warp from here. I'll trim this so it starts right there. And I will open the chat because someone has something to say. Yeah, we'll see how it comes out. Someone's saying, I don't know if it's good to use Skrillex as a groove. We'll see how this sounds. We'll see what kind of stuff happens. We might even just use the beginning. So if I do this and I select this particular region and then I right click that, I can actually do extract groove. And it gets stored right here. So the Skrillex groove, if I apply the Skrillex groove over my original drums, what's going on? Something's weird. It's still showing the Skrillex audio, but with my drum rack. Something is weird. It's going on. Something weird is going on with the. Okay, there we go. Okay. I think that's a bug. Okay, so what I can do is. Wait a second. I'm confusing myself now. Okay, never mind. Okay, we're all good. Let me just apply it to this particular groove because there's more stuff. So if I apply this groove to my track and I click commit, and let's say I want to absorb all the timing and all the velocity. This is what Ableton thinks I should do to make my track more Skrillex-like. Just like that, you're now Skrillex. It's very subtle stuff, I will admit. It's more dramatic depending on what you're trying to do. But you know, let's find a different spot in the groove. Let's find a different spot in the track. Maybe when the drums are going really hard. Okay, in Skrillex's track. Who doesn't like that? Let's see. All right, let's right-click that and click Extract Groove. Let's see what happens now. Okay, so let's go back to the drum rack. And pick a particular drum hit. And this time I will choose this groove. It actually came up with a very similar conclusion. The timing is a little different, right? But like if you look at this groove versus this groove, it's almost the same. So like for instance, you might really like a drummer. Like you might really like their style. You could like find their drumming on a particular track, and you could superimpose the feeling and the timing of their drumming on top of your particular track. That's pretty powerful. I mean, it's a really cool thing, and actually it's not used enough. There's a lot of stuff that you can do with this. So all the music that you enjoy listening, you could start making grooves out of it. It's essentially just creating a little bit of, it's creating a little like audio file like this, where it's trying to find the transients, and then it's basically using those as the basis to quantize to. So hopefully that makes sense. It's a pretty cool concept, and I encourage you to use it. Any questions on grooves? Okay, groovy. All right, so I guess I did say I was going to talk about multiband dynamics, and I guess I could talk about multiband dynamics now. So multiband dynamics is a pretty powerful tool. It allows you to apply compression on a band-by-band basis. So for instance, if I drag in multiband dynamics, and let me just put on my master track. Let me shut Skrillex up. And I'm going to put a multiband dynamics on my master. It's under audio effects, and it's called multiband dynamics. Now, there's many things that this plugin can do. For one, you can have band-by-band control over your sound. So for instance, I'll just play a particular. Oh, I didn't shut up Skrillex. Uh-oh. I'm missing my pads. Where are my pads? My pads are missing. Oh, did I turn off? Oh, why is this not working? Got my gate still. Oh, did I flip the gate and do something weird with the gate? Maybe. Oh. There's something weird going on with my Ableton right now. I'm gonna restart this project. Because you can see the track, but it's not actually showing, and there's just, it's buggy. So I'm gonna restart Ableton. Hopefully that works. It's all part of the game. Okay. All right, so let's see if the pads actually work now. Weird. I saved it exactly the way it was. Well, it's there, so it's all good. So now I think I even saved the multiband dynamics. Great. So the multiband dynamics, for one, you could just control the input level before it actually undergoes dynamic processing. It's actually lowering the amount of input that's coming into the plugin itself. You can compensate by doing this. But that's a silly use for this plugin. That's not really what it's designed to be used for. Like if you just subtracted here and added here, you'd get the same result. But it just kind of shows that if you don't do anything in between these two stages, you're going to get the same signal back. But what this allows you to do is it allows you to feed in a certain amount of signal in a certain bandwidth to be compressed, to kind of trigger the compressor a little bit more. So for instance, what you're seeing here are basically different thresholds for compression. And what you're seeing here is you could be above this line or below this line. You could be above this line or below this line. In the classic downward compression that we've talked about, if you're above this line, you're going to compress. So if I want to compress all these different bands using downwards compression, I would bring all these boxes down. And then I'd have to go to below mode. And then I'd have to set the ratio. Because right now, if you're below this threshold, nothing is going to happen. But, oh, sorry. I have to go to above mode, my bad. If you're above this line, basically you want to do more compression.
What's the difference between, how does above mode work?
Above mode just it's basically the it's basically referring to these. You could do compression and expansion using you could do downward compression or upwards expansion if you're above this line. Because if you're above this line, you could bring everything that's past this line down in volume, which would be downwards compression. But if you're above this line, you could also bring everything above this line to be louder, which would be upwards expansion. So for instance, right now it's in downwards compression just based on how I set the ratio. If I set the ratio to be anything below 1, it would become expansion. So everything would become louder. Right? It's getting louder. So the orange lines are showing you where you started in volume, and the blue lines, the difference between where the orange and blue are is where you end up in volume. So you might want to compress the mids for whatever reason. You want to add a lot of mid band compression, or you want to compress the highs a lot. Let's see what and once you compress, you have a more even keel timbre. At that point in time, you can boost the gain to suit your needs. Just remember, this particular plugin doesn't have makeup gain built in, but what it can do is because compressors make things softer when they're working. So you have to actually adjust the gain afterwards if you want things to actually be louder, which you usually do. You usually lower the dynamic range so that everything's equal, and then you have more, the sound is more even keel, so you can raise the output level as a result without clipping. So just listening to the mid frequency, like the high frequencies, I'm compressing the high, let me compress the high frequencies even more. It's really choking. It's tightening up those high frequencies. This is like extreme compression. You probably don't want anything like this, but you might, just for effect. But it's really making those highs more unified so that you can raise the volume and bring them out, and they'll be more present and louder, appear louder in the mix. Right? So this is all the above mode, right? Because anything that's above this line could either be made louder, which would be expansion, or softer, which would be compression. And more specifically, if you were above this line, sorry for the low res thing. If you're above this line right here, there's actually one line here. You're actually making everything softer by having a ratio that's greater, by having a ratio that's fractional, basically. 1 to 4. Where the right number is greater than 1, essentially. If the right number is smaller than 1, this is the same situation, right? You're above this particular threshold, and you're actually, everything that was originally at this level is now being made louder. It's being upwardly expanded. So multi-band compression really allows you to do all 4 of these types of things, and there's pictures in the OneNote for all of these different things, because you could, remember, you can apply these reductions to the left or right of the threshold. So the above modes refer to adjusting the volume to the right of this line, and the below modes refer to adjusting the volume to the left of this line. And upwards compression refers to making this line steeper. Sorry, upwards expansion refers to making this line steeper, and downwards compression refers to making this line flatter. Whereas it's the same thing on the other way. So downwards expansion would refer to making this line steeper because you're increasing the dynamic range. And then upwards compression would be referring to making this line flatter. I don't expect you to get that all in one sentence. It's taken me years to kind of process this, but this is basically what it is in a nutshell. If you can understand these 4 modes, you'll be way ahead of the curve.
A question about the multiband dynamics.
Sure.
Is using an OTT like basically the same thing? Like what's the difference?
An OTT basically is a specific preset on the multiband compressor. And what it's attempting to do is both perform upwards compression and downwards compression. So you're basically leveling out. So let's take a look at the OTT. So what you're doing down here on the above side is you're compressing by a lot. On the below side, you're compressing by a lot. So you're basically applying upwards compression and downwards compression. You're making the sounds softer whenever they cross when they go above the threshold, and you're making the sounds louder whenever they go below a threshold. So you're really evening out the sound from both sides just to make it sound really, really punchy. You have to set, when you use the OTT, the goal is, ooh. That's cool. It sounded like I was in a club for a second. I don't know why that was, but I like that sound. Still does. So when you have this OTT, what you want to do is you want to set the bounds of the thresholds so that you're compressing and expanding where you want to compress and expand. Because the goal is, like, when you're average, you want to basically make the sound really squashed. to adjust the levels accordingly. So the idea is if you don't set the thresholds correctly, it's not going to compress correctly, right? Because the threshold, because it's all dependent, right? You might find that the sounds in the mids get too loud. So that sounds nice, right? Without. So you're basically like compressing every single band in both directions. So you're completely squashing the dynamic range. And this is exactly the opposite of what you would do in classical and jazz music. Like the exact, like if you did this to a jazz musician or a classical musician, they'd be very offended. They'd say, "Hey man, look, I'm trying to play loud here. I'm trying to play soft here. Why are you making me all even? Like I'm trying to have some dynamic range." But like you looked at the Skrillex waveform, right? It just looks like a big sausage. And ultimately, it's like there's compression. It's just all the same volume, except for these little parts when he's like, "Oh my God," or whenever that kid or whoever is saying that, right? But most of the time, it's pretty even in dynamic range. So ultimately, I will tell you this: if you understand upwards, downwards, expansion, compression, you will be in a great position to understand a lot of stuff, because it's something that like confused me for so long. And I finally understood it. It's really simple once you finally break it down. So if you can understand this device right here, essentially, you're in a good position to understand kind of any dynamics processing that's thrown at you, because it incorporates all the different types of compression and expansion that you would ever run into. There's only so many, there's only so many ways you can flatten or steepen the curve, right? Now, that's basically what's happening. So you're squashing the dynamic range, and remember, this threshold it's very important that you set the threshold correctly. It's basically every time it falls below this line, it's being like, sorry, you want it to fall below the line? Sorry, we're going to boost you instead. Every time it goes above this line, it's saying, sorry, you want to go above this line? We're gonna shrink you instead. So that's why it's really important to set this line correctly. And you can see that the mids are the most like the lows and the highs, they kind of stay in the same range. Sorry, the lows and the mids stay in the same range. The highs are the ones that are fluctuating the most, which means that you might have to do a little bit more of this. So the OTT, some people treat OTT like a god, where it's like, oh, I can just throw this thing on there, it'll automatically make everything sound good. You still have to adjust the thresholds. Otherwise, it's not going to do anything. Like, it's not going to do what you want. It's not going to do everything you want it to do. Like, it's a catch-all to do a lot of stuff. It's doing all kinds of compression. And you might say, I'm done. I can just slap the OTT on. I'm done. No, you got to do a little bit of tweaking with the thresholds just to make sure that you're actually compressing what you want to compress. Oh, fun fact, that sample is the sound of a kid getting a personal best time at cup stacking. That's incredible. Yeah, I've seen some cool videos where people are breaking records, doing trick shots and things, so I can imagine that's a lot of fun. And she got to meet Skrillex too. That's awesome. It's incredible. That's a great side note. So yeah, and there's more stuff that can be said. Like basically, this is an important thing to be aware of. Basically, these frequency thresholds. Basically, how do you determine where the lows start and where the mids start? Well, you have to determine it based on frequency values. Where do you want the lows to end, essentially? And you can always use the trusty EQ-wise plugin to kind of determine that, to help you, perhaps. But the preset OTT probably has a pretty good idea of where the lows and highs are, to be honest. Right? That's probably fine. You could also set all three. Oh, you know what? There's a mode. I forgot about this. If you hold down there's a cool trick to, oh yeah, if you hold down Option, you can move the upper and lower at the same time. So that's kind of cool. But then again, like this might be useful actually. So if you hold down Option, you're like, oh, sound is around here, right? You're basically trying to reduce all wiggle room, literally, quite literally and figuratively, for this sound to kind of exist in. And you're trying to capture it so that you're like constraining it severely. But yeah, this is a beast of a plugin, and I highly recommend you learn how to use. If you understand this, you understand compression. I'll just put it that way. You understand compression and expansion. And then I guess this determines. So this is like, okay, so there's a dry wet control. So this is like completely compressed, and notice how like right now you hear a lot of background noise because I think it's basically like it's doing something where like all of the softer sounds are being boosted by 36.1 decibels. So you hear a lot of background noise. But if you want a perfect dry and wet sound, but perfectly parallel compressed, and you want exactly the same amount of dry signal and wet signal, you could set the amount to 50%. A lot of compressors don't have a dry and wet signal. So like I remember Chris was talking about sending a compressor to a return track, and you could have parallel compression that way. You might not have this capability on your plugin. But if your plugin has this, it's actually identical to having a return track and having a parallel copy. Of course, there are different ways you could interface if you put it on a return track, but this is essentially the same thing. So that's a little bit. I'm glad someone brought up the OTT. Let's see. Sorry if you already mentioned, but why would you want uncompressed signal? Why would you want an uncompressed signal in general? Because a lot of music genre, because when you're compressing a signal, you're losing the. Oh, why wouldn't you want 100% wet? Okay, so this is a great question. You might find that in your drums, for instance, you want the snappiness, the dynamic of the original drum, right? You want all the dynamic of the drum, but you want all the body that the compression gives you. Because when you don't compress a signal, you actually get to keep all the dynamic range. I'm glad you brought this up because, so for instance, if I were to take, let's put these on the drums, and I'll just leave this OTT here for fun, and I will drag this drum rack. No. I'm going to create a parallel compression, which basically I'll just do it directly. I'll use a return track to just show you the way that you could potentially do it another way. Create return track, and it's also nice because you can catch a bunch of different tracks using the same thing. So this is compression, right? So I will put a compressor on this. And I'll do a fast attack. That's fast enough. I'll do a high range.
It saves your CPU too, because you don't have multiple plugins. That's one of the major benefits.
That is because like if you have it on let's say you want to apply, we're going to apply this to the drums, but if you also want to have multiple other plugins get compressed, multiple other tracks get compressed, you can share the same return track. That's one of the best reasons, because reverb especially is super processor intensive. Compression, I've actually seen people get away with stacking compressors and compressors. I think Ableton's algorithm is more quicker, it's faster, but for like returns and delays especially, you're going to run into situations when you're like, I can't. It just makes a lot more sense to save on CPU. But with compressors, you can get the same benefit for sure. And so if I actually have this compression return, and I have my drums, I'm going to solo my drums. My drums are probably already super compressed, so that's unfortunate. Now I'm going to go to my return track, and I'm going to check out my compression, and I'm going to lower the threshold. So I'm going to send to my return track first. So So it's return track E. Okay, so what you get, once you send it over, you can actually, you can dial down the amount of that track. You can feed in, you can be like, so the idea is you have the raw dynamics of your drums. Like you have like the snare is hitting and you feel the transient and it's louder than the release of the snare. And there's some natural dynamic built in. But then you lose the bodiness, the sustained quality of like the entire drum sound, right? So what the compression does is it brings the entire bodiness of the drums in. And it's like it's felt as a flat entity. And you can kind of feel the warmth of the entire drum. You can also continue to feel the attack and the nuance of the uncompressed drums as well. And this would become more prominent if I showed you something like acoustic drums. Like the problem with the samples that I'm using right now is they're probably all compressed anyway. And like the sample pack I used was like a dubstep sample pack. So they were like, the goal was to make the drums as compressed to begin with. But if I have like a rock kit or like a, I could, it's 150, but I'll see if I can quickly do this just to kind of show you a difference. Plugins, samples, rock, groove, rock, drums, rock. Okay, cool, this will do. So I'll take this, I'll solo this track. Now I hear this. But let's say I want to keep the dynamic of this particular track. But I want a little bit with and without. You hear the dynamic, right? But with the compression, it fills it in a little bit more. Like it's more present. The compression fills it in a little bit more, but you still have the strikes and the quick attacks of all of the other drum hits that you want to keep. Because you want to keep the dynamic range, but you also want to compress it. So how do you do both? Well, that's the idea behind parallel compression. So this is the way that we did it using return track, but you could have also, since Ableton's compressors have a dry wet, you could just set this to 50%. And it's the same effect. But yeah, so that's basically, every time I talk about compression, it's a very compressed discussion. But I hope that you will understand. I hope you guys get this. For the longest time, I didn't understand the difference between upwards and downwards and upwards expansion and downwards expansion. If you can understand that, I feel like you will. I strongly advocate for that because there's lots of mistakes I've made in my journey to production. And this would have saved so much agony if I just knew the difference between those things. It would have saved so much misunderstanding. So I really encourage you to study the difference between these different modes. I'd like to make another graph. I got this off the internet. And I have to like make my own drawings for these, but it's, don't make the same mistakes I made. Just learn what these 4 different things are from the get-go. And I think you may think that you're only going to use downwards compression until you run into a complicated plugin and you're like, oh, how does the expander work again? Or like, how does the gate work again? And then you're like, the theory of this helps a lot. So I think that's good for today. I didn't talk about session view. So I'm going to talk about that next class. And we might have less discussion on each individual track. We'll just kind of play the tracks in class, but we'll talk about session view next class. And this is useful, I think, that I talked about this today because you can use this in your own tracks to make them sound fuller and more poppin' when everyone listens. So hopefully that all makes sense. And if there's any more questions, just please feel free to ask me. I'll be around right now, or just email me and we can talk. And I guess that's all, folks, for today. Oh, can we talk about the final assignment? The final assignment, I talked a little bit about it during break, but it's basically, I'd like it to be like on the order of 2 minutes at least. And it's going to be due on Saturday. I'll create the assignment right now. But on Thursday, everyone's going to play a track. that they feel comfortable with and proud of. And it doesn't have to be the whole thing, but if it's the whole thing, it's the whole thing. And then on Saturday, it's due on Saturday. There's no constraints in terms of like screenshots and all that stuff. Just make a track that you like, you know, that sounds good to you. Have it be on the order of 2 minutes or longer. And you can recycle an old assignment and work off an old track. I encourage you to do that because you've already done the work, and you can tweak it. You can add compression or whatever you want to do. You can even remix another student's track if they're cool with it and you want to do that. That's basically all I have to say, and that's what will appear on the OneNote. So in fact, I'm going to type this up as people are leaving. So this new page, this is going to be final 2 minutes, order of magnitude 2 minutes or greater. I say that because someone might have a 1 minute and 59-second track, and I won't like dock you. You can reuse old material, just add some more finesse. Feel free to remix another student's work if they're cool with it. And I think I said one more thing. I can't remember what I said. Due on Saturday. Oh yeah, I did say one more thing. No screenshots. Just include something that sounds good to you. Due Saturday at midnight, and please turn it in on Saturday at midnight so that I can grade it on Sunday and put your grades. I think you know, everyone's doing well grade-wise. Just make sure you get that final in. And yeah, that's it. And then there will be a Canvas assignment where you can submit.
Professor?
Yeah.
So for the discussion comments, I think I missed like the bits where you like were talking about them. Like, is there any specific due date on when the comments are supposed to be done by? Like, I'm sorry, like I like kind of do it a week after the assignment's due, and I don't know if that's like late.
No, I just want to sense engagement. So just the fact that you're even having this conversation with me, it's like I'll be able to sense that you're putting in the comments, and it's just so that there's a community aspect to it. It's
yeah.
So yeah, basically just as much as you can, as soon as you can, and I'll look through. And I haven't been following on with the threads. I've just been preoccupied with other stuff, but I've noticed that there are lots of responses, and the ones I have read are really cool, and I like that everyone is being supportive of each other, and I think that's great. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, my pleasure.
When you say no screenshots, do you want no screenshots, or what do you want?
Oh, okay. So I guess I should say no screenshots required, but feel free to include any context in any manner.
So you can put screenshots if you want.
Absolutely. Actually, it is nice. Just in fact, yeah. You know what? I guess no screenshot requirements for me, but feel free to include any context.
Okay. I wasn't sure if you didn't want them because like it would be too much.
No. I actually appreciate screenshots. I just don't want to. I don't want to put on any constraints. Like in fact, the screenshots you showed me, because like I don't open everyone's Ableton project because it takes. But the screenshots help me understand what people are doing. So I remember when I saw your screenshot, it like prompted me to open up the Ableton project to see like to dive in about what they were doing. So it's like it gives me more context and it helps me understand more of what's going on. But yeah, it's that's cool, man. The screenshots you included were very cool.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
All right, take care, Professor.
Yeah, take care, man.
I guess I have a question on. Well, I have two questions, but I think I'm just going to email you the other one because I don't really know how to phrase it right now. Because it's about ICAM.
Oh,
Like-
okay. Yeah.
Stuff like that. I just want to know about it a little bit, but I need to like actually think about like what I want to know. But for the just a quick.
I think you cut out for a second. I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry, I cut out. A quick question on like the mysterious version.
Well, you know what? Really quickly, let me just pause this.
Okay.
Let's see. Pause. Stop.